its staff, management, or sponsors. Welcome to the Caregiver Reality Show, hosted by gerontologist and family caregiver expert David Levy, speaking on a topic that is not only a national problem, but an international one, and represents one of the biggest dilemmas facing us today: Alzheimer's disease and dementia. With no cure in sight and hundreds more being diagnosed weekly, Alzheimer's is more feared than cancer or heart disease. Join us as David Levy breaks it down and educates, informs, and explains useful caregiver strategies and techniques that 25 years of non-clinical family caregiving have taught him. You can listen or call in and be part of the show. 888-565-1470 to ask your questions. And now, here's David Levy.
Good evening, Boca Raton, America, and the world. This is the Caregiver Reality Show. I'm your host, David Levy, wearing my new glasses, and my co-host, Paul, is wearing his glasses. So today, we look very studious, and we hope to bring you a great show. At 7 o'clock, we have Dr. David Hilfiker, the doctor that is totally confused about what he has, but he definitely has cognitive impairment. But the NIH unhooked him from Alzheimer's, but we've been following him in his blog, and he's not quite sure where he is. And so we'll hear it first from him. He's out in California visiting his daughter, and I spoke to him this afternoon to confirm that he'd be on, and so I'm looking forward to hearing from him.
So am I.
Yeah. So, Paul, how was your week?
It was an interesting week. It reminded me of the old NASA getting ready for a launch of the rocket.
Okay.
Because with Christmas coming, we were in countdown mode to make sure that all systems would go, that we didn't have a clog in the fuel line, and that we were going to actually get the rocket off the ground so that we can get out for dinner, which is a big deal for Christmas.
Right. Okay. Well, not only that, but you have a reservation, which makes it even better.
Well, you know, it's always a tentative commitment, as you well know.
Right. Well, we had my sister was down over the weekend with my two nieces, one who's a doctor and the other who's a lawyer. At least we have one Jewish doctor. And we all had an opportunity to have dinner together with my daughter, and it was great. I mean, I see my sister every now and then, but as I've told you, my niece, who's the doctor, is a cardiopulmonary surgeon, and this year she has an NIH grant out of Columbia University, and she's doing transplants. So in the middle of the night, she gets a phone call. She's on a plane out of Teterboro Airport, and gosh knows where, you know. And so she was down here a few weeks ago. They were able to get a successful heart at Delray Medical. But so anyway, we're back. And right now we're going to talk a little bit about caregiving and some of the other stuff that we think is important. You know, with the holidays here, whether it was Hanukkah, Christmas, the New Year, there's a lot of things that go on, especially with caregivers. I watched it in my groups over the last couple of weeks. There's a condition that's called SAD, seasonal affect disorder. And I see a lot of it in my caregivers, especially the spousal caregivers who are once again having a holiday season where their loved one may be in a facility or their home, but they can't get out, they can't do the things that they used to, and it really drives home the role of caregiver.
Especially in the first year. Because that first year is a transition year where it's a recognition that it's no longer going to be what we always did. I mean, I see that with my dad passing. This is the first Christmas now that we are not going to be seeing my dad as it was with Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. And it really is
impactful.
Yeah, it is impactful. It's a transition point that becomes a life marker, a mile marker, and it's different after that. And each subsequent year, I would imagine for many of your caregivers in your group, the pain just intensifies.
Yeah, and whether it's Hanukkah, Christmas, but definitely the New Year, you know, because everybody kind of remembers what they do on New Year's. Even if it's small and quiet with a few friends, you did things. And when you no longer can do them and you're sitting home, not that friends might not invite you, but you know it's going to be a very limited scenario, and you've got to get home early, and if you're going to watch the ball fall from Times Square, you're going to do it at home. Not that a lot of people that don't have caregiving issues don't do that, but I always found New Year's, even growing up, was kind of a pretentious night. It was, if you could get a reservation somewhere, it was always overpriced.
David, come on.
It was always overpriced and so service.
Guy Lombardo, how could you not like Guy Lombardo?
Oh, well, that's the other guy, not Start the Bubble Machine. That's
Lawrence Welk.
Lawrence Welk, right. Well, what can I tell you? We're a bunch of old geezers, and we can recall that stuff now. Freddie wouldn't remember it, or Linda, because they're too busy at the edge of the technical envelope bringing us
Dick
the
Clark
latest.
Era.
Right. Well, we're still Dick Clark era.
Yeah.
Right. Although everybody that has now taken over for him for New Year's in New York. Anyway.
I got a question for you.
What?
The incidences of depression, particularly among the caregivers that you're seeing in the group, do you see it, first of all, as the support leader, and are they conscious of those changes within themselves?
Well, that's a good question. In the beginning, they're not really aware of anything. I had 3 new ones last week, and they all, a matter of fact, 2 of the 3 were so angry at these were wives, angry at their husbands for getting sick.
Wow.
And, that's kind of a difficult scenario, but because they've seen enough of it around in the communities that they live in, that they realize now this is happening to them. And so we got into some real good discussions about anger, guilt, and resentment. And they feel very guilty about feeling the way they do, but they're very resentful of the fact that now they are a spouse of somebody that has dementia. And it's very tough for them to come to grips with. And 2 of them were so angry, but by the time the group got through, because that session is a good 2 hours, the group had at least gotten them a little bit to open up. And that's really the first thing that's so important. Normally when somebody comes into the group as a new person, they'll sit there. We don't really expect them to talk the first time because they want to hear. And many times they'll come in and they'll say, well, my loved one is much more high functioning than everybody else. And then the caregivers that have been down that path say, when you have dementia, you may have a higher functioning individual right now, but unfortunately it's a very slippery slope, and we all came in feeling the same way, and it's a great levelizer. And so the depression in the beginning isn't as great as it is about a year or 2 in. Just like depression is hidden inside of dementia. It's one of the most underdiagnosed conditions of dementia.
Rewind that. Are you saying for the patient or for the caregiver?
For the patient as well. Because we have a tendency to sweep everything under the dementia rug. And if you stop to think about an individual who has gone through the process of recognizing that they had dementia and they have slowly succumbed to it, and the aspect of a terminal illness, ultimately chronic, it's enough to get anybody depressed. Anybody that has a chronic illness more than likely has an aspect of depression to what they do, whether it's cancer, whether it's a stroke. It really doesn't make a difference. But once you realize that that path has been set for you, it can be very, very depressing. And no matter how much you try and keep a positive attitude, which is important, and take, the Wellbutrins and the Lexapros and the Celexa, it still doesn't stop the issues from undermining your day-to-day activities. It slips in no matter how good the medical profession might be. And so it's difficult. And when the holidays come,
Worse.
it's much more difficult because they too, to the extent they can, remember what it used to be. Now, those that have progressed down the path may be in a dementia facility. And, we're learning, just as a quick aside, Paul, there have been a lot of studies out lately that we don't realize how much a dementia patient still really understands. And even though they can't communicate back, but they still can hear, they still can see, they still have their sense of smell and touch. And when you say things around them, good or bad, they do react and they do understand, even though they may not be able to process it the same way. And to be able to turn around and tell you, like we'll hear with Dr. Hilfiker in a little while, what he's going through. And his cognitive impairment is progressing in his mind, but yet he still has the ability to conduct some of these seminars that he does and to be able to have a discussion about his illness. And even though he's taken the last week off for Christmas not to write his usual blog, he did write one on the 14th. And if we have an opportunity, we'll touch base with that.
I'm really excited to hear him tonight. He's just an amazing person to be able to give forth those feelings and to be able to emote what's going on in his life and to be willing to share it with so many people. It's just invaluable. I'm going to be very curious to see the difference.
I think we all will
between the last conversation and this one.
Right. There's been a lot of conversation. I've been working with a few groups, not support groups, but to recognize there's something in the workplace, and you know it well, called presenteeism. Mm-hmm. And essentially what that means is, as opposed to absenteeism, you show up, but you're really caught up in other issues, and that's something very common for caregivers. And I wrote a paper back in 2003 that I updated in 2007 that recognized presenteeism in the workplace caused by caregiving. And we're watching the percentages rise of older people in the workplace. When I say older, typically the way it's been categorized is the tail end of the boomers, like 45 to 50 to 64. But today I caught a little piece of AARP. And what they said is 9 out of 10 older workers say they are continuing to grow in their work. Among employed adults, 45 to 74, 91% agree with the statement, "I'm proud to work for the company that employs me." Other statements about work life reported by older workers: "I'm continuing to grow in my work," 87%. "My job is an important part of who I am." Well, that I realize, because when you retire, and all of a sudden you've got the gold key and the watch, right? But you've lost the job. You lose a lot of your identity, and that's very true of caregivers. When their loved one passes away, they have been so consumed with caregiving, it becomes addictive. But the point is that now, according to this AARP study, that we're really seeing another 10 years in the workplace to 74, and I don't know what the percentage is now between 45 and 74. I'm trying to dig into their statistics, but they gave the results and not the underlying report. That tells me that there's even more caregiving in the workplace, as well as issues of aging in the workplace that the workplace has not seen before in dealing with folks 65 to 74. And how the workplace is going to adapt to that, and to now begin to recognize. I've been working with one of the big companies, as you know, that's very involved in the support of workers in the workplace, and we're putting together an opportunity to take a different kind of a look at caregiving, because one of the problems is that historically in the workplace, you have 3 different organizations that deal with it: disease management, absentee management, which means if you're not there, they can understand that something's wrong, and the standard employee assistance programs that do information and referral. The problem with the first two, absenteeism and disease management, is caregiving isn't a disease. So it's very hard to find it using their bait and hook. And unfortunately, most of the EAP programs, employee assistance, are information and referral. Well, that's all well and good if you know what it is you're looking for and why you need it. But there is so much more to understanding the caregiver role than calling somebody up and saying, you know, I'm having a real problem with my wife, my mother, my dad, he's 87, he's this and that, and they say, well, here's a phone number for a geriatric case manager, and I'm not case manager bashing, or, you know, or here's a nursing home or an assisted living facility. But do you really even know? Most people don't. They don't know the difference between independent living, assisted living, memory, etc. Here in Florida, we're much more literate because we have so much. But you get out of Florida, you start to go west, and I have some statistics, if we bother to do it, that show that only 13% of the assisted independent living, of which is about 2.7 million, are dementia. That's 350,000 beds for what is now pretty close to 6 million dementia patients. And certainly the nursing homes are only there as a last resort if that dementia patient really needs Medicaid, or if they have enough clinical other issues that they don't have a choice but to be in a nursing home. So we don't have a lot. And so when I keep telling people this is all going home, I'm not kidding. And, you know, one of the things that we all have to realize is if you've never recognized caregiving for a dementia patient, and we stay with dementia, Paul, because you and I both agree it's the toughest caregiving that there is, regardless
Absolutely.
of what kind of dementia. But if you don't have a plan, if you don't understand, you know, one of the reasons that I wrote the book on practical problem solving for family caregivers is because you have to spoon feed like anything else. There's no jump start in caregiving. You got to come up the path and understand the layout. You need to understand the system. You need to understand why things don't work the way you expect them to. And it's very, very difficult unless you've really been oriented to it. And most of the things that are out there are either lists of 10 things that a caregiver ought to do, but they're not exactly sure why, even though it makes some sense.
Or how to choose a nursing home.
Or how to choose a nursing home when there really are a lot of other things long before you need a nursing home. It's how do I keep my loved one at home? Because the likelihood is I can't afford a nursing home, and whether or not I ventured forth early enough to do asset protection and some of the other things, if you have a few dollars, because you have to remember, if you don't have Medicaid and you try and do it on your own, and you're typical middle class or lower, I mean, where nursing homes are $10,000 to $15,000 a month, you'll be broke before you need it. And even though that may qualify your spouse to be able to stay in that nursing home with Medicaid, you're broke. And that's a real tough place to be at 82 or 78, and whatever you had in savings you spent on your loved one, never realizing that you still have to provide for yourself, and a $1,200 or $1,300 Social Security payment, a small pension,
not going far,
aren't going to get you there from here.
Well, you were talking about the workplace before, and certainly with the issues of being distracted by caregiving at home, because it's not going to be hung up like your coat when you come in, to use
Right.
one of your expressions.
Right.
The other problem is it's that as the workforce is getting older, what we call senior moments are also becoming more and more of the reality. So it's impactful for the business in terms of productivity, but also in terms of potential errors that can be made.
You know, you couldn't have put it more eloquently. And just as we were talking about some friends we know who all of a sudden they've got eyesight issues, not that you can at a young age, but all of a sudden they can't read the computer as clearly, as well as to have that senior moment. And folks, senior moments don't mean you have dementia. It just means, the way I put it, if you're 70 years old like I am, When you were 40, you had 40,000 books in your library in your brain, and you could make it around the stacks pretty quickly and find what you needed. Now I have 70,000 books. My knees aren't the best, so I don't get around as fast, and it's a little tougher to find them. But I find that if, we all go through the list, A, B, C, trying to remember a name.
Right.
And as long as it pops up within the next 5 hours, you're good. It's not so much whether you forgot where you put the keys, it's whether you forgot how to drive. And but that doesn't mean that when you start to see signs that you're not remembering or that you're more forgetful, either you or your spouse, it really makes sense to go and check it out, even though there may not be a cure right now for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or, temporal frontal lobe dementia. Knowing early enough allows you to plan. And that's what my book and some of the others that are out there are really all about. Because if you don't have a plan, just like you planned for retirement, just like you plan to take a trip, you don't just, unless you just are one of those people that decide to do a cruise getaway, go down and see if there's a ticket. But I mean, if you're going away for a while, you plan on where you're going, what your wardrobe's going to be, you check out the weather, you get a good hotel. And so how can you venture down a path of illness, such as dementia, without understanding what the needs are that you may have and how to call them up and what you can expect and not expect?
And what exacerbates the problem is you're not going to begin that journey until there is a need.
Correct. Nobody ever plans for caregiving in advance.
No, absolutely not. It's never going to happen to me. It's never going to happen to someone I know. I will never be a caregiver, but the reality is we will be, and probably multiple times.
Right. And so knowing you've been, and I've been already multiple times, with my own family, etc., spouse, as the audience knows, we're not exceptions to the rule. We are more the rule than the exception.
And that, in my opinion, David, is what makes this hour so special each week. Because those who may not yet be caregivers, but see it coming down the road, they're getting a heads up of what that road might look like and perhaps spur a little bit of action.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with having a plan on the shelf, even if you don't need it right now.
Hurricane season.
Yep. I mean, how many people wait until the morning of the hurricane to first buy some plywood and have to stick it up? I mean, it's no different. If you know that things are going to change in your life simply by aging, as a gerontologist, I can tell you there's healthy aging, but there are still issues that happen. If you haven't put your durable powers of attorney or advance directives together so that you can guide the clinical aspect of things as well as other aspects of your own planning, and not just estates, wills, and trusts for when you're dead, but what we're talking about is planning for while you're alive, so that if you do run into issues like this, at least you have some idea. You've sat down in a calmer moment and looked at what the alternatives are. And one of the things, I'm not hawking the book tonight, folks, but you can get it on the internet at caregiverreality.com. And in about 3 weeks, it'll be available as an ebook on Kindle.
Yes.
Yes. And so one of the things you need to realize is that what we've put together is easy to read, easy to use, is not a lot of technical speak, and I don't tell you how I took care of my mom or my dad. I tell you, based on 25 years of experience, what it is that caregivers go through, what it is that they need to know. And in the course of, we also have a caregiver questionnaire in there that when you fill it out, it lets you know all of the things that you're missing, that you need to know, so that when something happens, you've got them there. But more importantly, we show you how to take that information and turn it into your own story. The story of how you're dealing with mom or dad, the story of what's going on with you as it relates to being a caregiver for somebody else.
And if I may just carry that thought
Please
for a second. I had a conversation recently with an acquaintance of mine, and we were just talking about this whole thing. I asked him, I said, didn't your dad have Alzheimer's? And he said, yeah. He said he passed away and he had Alzheimer's. I said, and I seem to remember you talking about your grandmother. She said, yeah, she had Alzheimer's too. I said, no, I'm not a physician and I'm not a researcher, but what do you think the odds are that there's that possibility may come into your life?
Right, that you're in the gene pool.
You're in the gene pool, and you know what he said to me?
What?
I never thought about it that way.
Well, and see, when you put together the plan, and it takes you back 2 or 3 generations, and it says, what did my mother's sisters have? What did my mother's brothers have? What did grandparents have? And you begin to understand whether or not you're in succession for it, or whether or not, based on history, that mom or dad may be having some of those same issues.
Becomes an aha moment.
Oh, a big aha moment. Anyway, we're getting close to station break, and right after the station break, our call-in guest is Dr. David Hilfiker, who has been blogging over the last year and a half about, first it started out as I have Alzheimer's, and it's slowly changed into what's really going on in my life. So we're going to take that station break, and we're going to call David, and we're going to speak with him. So take it away. On this, got to the station break. All right, now who's going to go out and call?
Hello, are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse, parent, or loved one who can no longer care for themselves? Are you dealing with Alzheimer's disease and don't know what to do? Are you stressed, burned out, frustrated, and don't know where to turn? Have you realized that your doctor, lawyer, and mental health professionals don't have real practical answers? You need a non-clinical family caregiver expert that the professionals turn to. You need David Levy. He is a family caregiver expert with 25 years of active experience with thousands of family caregivers. He can help you provide a better quality of life for you and your loved one. Contact David Levy at dlevy@caregivered.org. That's dlevy@caregivered.org. Or call 561-482-0086. And let's get your mental road to healing started.
Talk 1470 WWNN Pompano Beach, WKIS HD3 Boca Raton, Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
Well, we're back, and in just a moment, we're going to hook through to Dr. David Hilfiker. You're listening to us on WWNN 1470 AM, or you're watching us on caregiverreality.com live show, or maybe iHeart.com, Florida, and WNN. So if we could hook up to Dr. Hilfiker, let's see how he's doing out in California. Dr. Hilfiker, are you there?
I am indeed.
Good. Good evening, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining the show.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right, and so how are you doing today? I know we spoke this afternoon, and I've been following the blog right through the one of a few days ago where, well, first, for background, you had the one with the laundry. And the train,
Yeah.
we read that one. And the laundry, even though you had your confusion between the wet and dry laundry, I think anybody would have a problem with that. So I didn't see where that was a great shortcoming on your part. But when I read the one that you published on the 14th about the roller coaster of ups and downs, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that particular blog, because it was really very interesting.
Remind me specifically what the event was.
Okay, well, first you started out saying that it's been a roller coaster over the last few months because you couldn't put the cabinet together with your son. You had
Right,
the
okay.
issues on
Got
the
it.
train, and then the laundry incident of 2 weeks ago. And so you said it's starting to sink in. And one of the points that you made was that even though you were able to conduct a 1.5 hour session back in Washington, and that you were able to do certain things, you started to conjecture about whether or not you ought to be driving.
Right.
All right,
Right.
and so
Um,
that was the sense of the blog, but I thought it was very insightful on your part that you said, now people don't concern themselves right now with my driving, and people think, it's safe. But you went on to say, what happens if I'm doing 70 miles an hour and all of a sudden I don't know where I am, or I forget that I'm supposed to make a left or a right.
Right.
So you got to the point, I think, towards the end. I'm gonna just quote you when you came down to the end. You said, "But if I'm in the middle of traffic going 70 on the interstate, when I have an episode of confusion, I don't know quite how to handle it. Should I be evaluating my driving ability on the basis of my baseline impairment, or on the basis of how I am at my most confused?" And yeah, I got to tell you something, Dr. Hilfiker. Whatever it is that you have, your ability, your introspective capability to see it and define it, even though you have these cognitive episodes,
Yeah.
is remarkable. I don't know whether it's because of your medical training or you're just a brilliant individual who's able to step outside themselves and see yourself. So I'd like to
Well,
pick it up
certainly
from,
it's-
what are you going to do about the car?
Well, I don't know for sure yet. I think that my conclusion is that you really do have to evaluate yourself at your worst possible, because that's possible to happen. When I look more carefully at the particular episodes that I had, it seemed to me that they would not be dangerous on the highway. And that's a judgment call that I'm going to kind of review with my neurologist when I see him. But specifically, if you get a little confused about which way to go, then you basically slow down or pull over. It's not a question of not being able to control the car,
Right.
or not being aware that there's traffic. So, I had a couple of replies on my blog that says, "Stop driving now," period. People looking at, the questions I had, others saying, just keep watching yourself. And the problem is that the person who has cognitive impairment himself is probably the last one to know whether
Yes.
he ought to be driving or not. And so you ultimately have to depend on somebody else's judgment about that. So
And
I'm
one
going
of the
to-
things that you need to be aware of, that when you go and consult with your neurologist, even though right now you think you're capable of driving, if he
Right.
says you ought to stop driving and he puts it in his record, that's it. Because God forbid you have an accident, you're unhooked from your insurance. They go
Right.
back and they look, and that has been an unfortunate consequence of a lot of people down here who were fiercely independent, and the doctor said what they said, and they went back to driving anyhow and had a bad accident, and the insurance company didn't cover them for either the liability or the damage to the automobile. So you have to be
Right.
careful what you ask for. And I would tiptoe in on that. I'm not telling you whether or not you should or shouldn't drive, but once the neurologist says you shouldn't, that's it.
Yep. Well, I've been prepared for that for a long time. Once my neurologist, or really anybody else who knows how I drive well, says no driving, then I don't want to be out there.
Okay. You know what?
Anyway, I'm not a person who needs a car a lot, so it's not as hard for me as it might be for some other people who don't.
Well,
have a
in
car.
Washington, D.C., you're an urbanite.
Right.
And I recall from earlier blogs, although you did take some road trips down to Virginia to visit your friend in prison, which
Right.
a couple times you didn't recall having made it there.
Yeah.
So whether or not you remembered getting to prison or whether or not you didn't remember the road trip,
Right.
I guess you even had some early warnings months ago.
That was actually, that event was about 3.5 years ago now.
Oh, was it that long ago?
It was that long ago. It was the first, in retrospect, it's the first thing that was obvious about my cognitive impairment.
Well, I was a little late in getting to your blog, and I read them, retrospectively,
Yeah, of course.
and they're fascinating. Your view of yourself, and I have my co-host on, Paul. Paul, do you have something you'd like to ask the doctor?
Doctor, I have to tell you, I am a huge fan. I give you so much credit for the writing, for the openness, the candor. It really is inspirational for so many of our listeners who are family caregivers who are going through these same issues with a loved one. I did have a question for you, though. As 2014 is right in front of us, what's going through your mind as you look at the new year starting to approach?
Well, there's still an awful lot of confusion about what my diagnosis is, and therefore what my prognosis, my future is. So right now, I just have to live with a lot of uncertainty. And what has helped a lot, that I've learned a lot over the past 12, 15 months, is that to the extent that I can live in the present and not think about 2014, the better my life is. So, obviously you have to make kind of concrete plans about specific things, but at this point, there's just too many unknowns to really be speculating about who I'm going to be or what it's going to be like. Don't know.
Live in the moment.
Right. That's what we tell our caregivers. It only comes up one day at a time, and whatever you think it's going to be, many times isn't what we think, both good and bad. And in your case, it was interesting when you went from what you thought was, and I guess it is, objective cognitive impairment to subjective cognitive impairment, because it seems like you have it, even though I guess the psychometric testing that NIH and others have done did not reveal anything of any great import or anything that really moved the dial to confirm or deny what it is you're going through with this cognitive impairment. Is that correct?
Well, it's gotten more confused. When I was out at NIH, that's indeed what the neuropsychologist told me, that he looked at the exam, looked at the results of it, and said, you're cognitively normal. Then I found it very difficult to believe that because of as you say, the subjective cognitive, my awareness of my own impairment. Mm-hmm. It turns out that I have a good friend who is a neuropsychologist and looks at these tests and administers them and evaluates them all the time. And I had the results, the raw results, and so I gave them to her. And she said she just disagreed really, really strongly that my results were normal. And she said, you've got, you were quite intelligent before, so you've got a lot of cognitive reserve. So some of these things, so it can appear to other people. But if you really look at this test and look at the relationships between some of these results, then it's very clear that there's impairment. So it's more confused. I've now got two experts telling me two different things.
Right, and you know what? I'm not sure right now they're going to a third. It's kind of like arbitration. NIH picked one, you picked one, and But I read in one of your blogs the conversation that you had with your friend who is the psychotherapist, and I thought that what she had to say, notwithstanding the fact that it was different in outcome, I think that her interpretations, and I'm not a psychologist or anything close to it, but I've seen a lot of people with a lot of cognitive impairment. At least she acknowledged the obvious, even if it wasn't there against the interpretation of how you took the test.
Okay, I haven't actually put out there yet much about what you said, so I'm not clear what you're referring to.
Well, you did mention that you had a neuropsychologist or friend who looked at it and made mention to you that, notwithstanding what the NIH said, she thought some of the information that she interpreted in that test gave her, just as you said, maybe a different conclusion or pointed her in a slightly different direction.
Yes. Yeah, she and I have since then sat down and spent about an hour going over the specific parts of the test, and I haven't written about that yet on the blog.
Okay. But, you know, one of the things that you do give credibility to, and it should be comfort to some, is that folks that have the ability, that were very bright, that had great intellectual capability, and I see it both in your professional work as you have related it, and how you have taken it upon yourself to be an educator as well as the subject of the education, that you have managed to keep your brain active, and maybe that plasticity, the ability to keep that hypothalamus working, notwithstanding your cognitive issues, has been a boon to you, because even though you have what you have, your ability to say what you say is remarkably crystal clear.
Yeah. But part of it is, and this is what I was, I referred to, I guess, a couple times, is that cognitive impairment is very spotty. I mean, there are some things that I have not had any impairment in, and in fact, almost one, I guess I wouldn't say better, but certainly no impairment in. For instance, as I mentioned before, in a small group, leading a group discussion, I've been as sharp as ever. On the other hand, doing certain kinds of computer work, trying to keep very complex thought in my mind, that's gone way downhill. Memory has gone way downhill. So there's some things that don't seem to be impaired at all, and others that are quite impaired. So it's very interesting.
Yes, it is. What does your wife think? I mean, you know, she sees you every day or almost every day, except I don't know whether she travels with you every time you go to see your son or your daughter.
Not every time, but she's with me now.
Okay. What does she think? What's her feeling about all of this? I don't mean from a scientific perspective, but of somebody that knows you very, very well.
Yeah. Well, she, of course, notices some things, especially in terms of memory. She's still not confident that these are not changes of old age.
Okay.
So she's able to kind of hold these things in...
Like in abeyance until she sees more?
Yeah. She's just saying, I hear you, I believe you, but in terms of what I'm actually seeing, obviously your memory's going downhill, but isn't that, possible old age that's causing that?
Okay.
So she's had some questions all along.
It was interesting because, when you go back to some of the things that you talked about, like your predicament with the vacuum cleaner and the music coming from the alley, and it turned out that it was the radio on the desk or on the, the little table in front of the window. Those were definitely memory incidences. But yet, even though it may be, quote, an aging brain, and it certainly may be, and I've never asked you how old you are. How old are you, Dr. Hilfiger?
I'm 68.
Okay. Well, I got a couple of years on you, and I wish I was as cognitively intact as you are. But I mean, it's just so interesting to see how you weave in and out of all of the events in your life, and I think that your wife has a very positive attitude. And I wouldn't call it denial. I just think she's learned how to compartmentalize until she knows more.
That's right. And she's very good at living with uncertainty. I can't imagine being married to a better person in terms of just being able to ride through this with me. And, if I eventually do need care, then to be the caregiver. I can't imagine anybody better, actually.
Well, I'm sure she'll be an excellent caregiver. I mean, she's watched you, with your minor incidences, and I have a feeling that she'll be just fine because she's a realist, even though she may say it's old age and I'll wait and see. But I have a feeling the little that we know about her from some of the things you've mentioned in your blogs, that she's a strong woman, that she'll stand by you and do what she has to do. How are your kids dealing with it?
Well, both. One child is over in India right now, so I haven't seen her very much. The daughter that I'm visiting now, who's 42, I guess, and my grandkids, they recognize my daughter especially recognizes the deficits. And for her, there really isn't any question. She's a psychotherapist, social worker, and so she's aware of these things. She's grateful that it's going slowly as it is. When we met here last Christmas, certainly I didn't expect to be in as good shape as I am now a year later, and we're all grateful for that.
Yes.
But we've played games, for instance, and she's been aware that I haven't quite followed in a couple of places, and really quite gentle, sort of corrected me about this and that, and we just went on to play the game. It wasn't anything embarrassing or difficult or whatever. She relied on both her respect for her father and her professional training. Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, and yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, you're very lucky to have family like that. Paul and I have both seen children that constantly correct and want their parent to somehow or other go back to knowing that which they just can't remember. And it's frustrating for everybody when they do that. So I think it's a real credit to her. And how many grandchildren do you have?
Well, I have two here. I'm in California now, and I've got one over in India.
Okay. So you're going to have Christmas morning with your grandchildren and your daughter, and your wife is there with you?
Yeah, and all of my son-in-law's relatives. He's got 8 sisters, so...
Oh, well, that's great. All right. Do you get to carve the turkey?
Pardon me? No. I have avoided turkeys forever, so I don't know how to cut a turkey.
Okay, that's fair. Doctor, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I want to wish you, your family, your grandchildren, the in-laws, a very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy New Year. And we'll be following along with you, and I hope it goes as slow as it's going so that in 2014 we get an opportunity to speak with you again. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to have you on the show.
Happy holidays, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lee.
Thank you. Well, folks, there you've had it. One of the brightest individuals I've met so far with a cognitive impairment. And his attitude is very healthy, and his wife as well. Well, maybe it's just growing old. I would love for that to be the case, and hopefully it may be, but I think realistically the kind of cognitive moments that he has had would lead us to believe that it might be otherwise, but it's progressing slowly. And one of the things that he's doing that's so important, and caregivers need to realize this as well, is he is constantly keeping himself busy with the things that he enjoys, whether it's speaking, reading, having those small groups. He is constantly keeping himself stimulated. Over the last 2 or 3 months, he's gone and taken a couple of trips by train, even though he had a little problem getting from the
lounge car,
car in back to his seat. But yet he's always stimulating himself and finding other ways of dealing with his problem. And I think that's something we all need to realize, that and especially for caregivers that still have their loved ones at home, even with an aide, we have to be very careful, because sitting around in a chair for a couple hours and watching Oprah is not stimulation. If you were to go to a good senior center, some that we have around here, like a May Volan or a Ruth Rails, you'll find that they're painting. The music is a tremendous input. My friend Scott Greenberg, who owns Comfort Care, his son-in-law has designed a program incorporating music for folks that have dementia, where they actually get an instrument to play. I'm not talking about a trombone, but they're percussion instruments, and they love it. And it is so rewarding when you hear them get into the music, and they use a lot of like the Star Spangled Banner and John Philip Sousa kind of music, and they love it. And they participate, and that's the kind of stimulation that I'm talking about, not the tube. And so we have to recognize that not stimulating that brain isn't healthy, whether we have cognitive impairment or not. We all need to do something with our brains and keep ourselves busy.
One of the things, David, that is so striking in speaking with Dr. Hilfiger and reading his blogs is the differentiation between his analytical ability that he still retains and the memory loss that he claims that he has. And sometimes we tend to lump this all together, and we give it a name and a label without actually examining the uniqueness of each individual and what deficits or what skills they might actually have.
Right. I want to go back to just mention something when he was talking about driving. And he was very introspective to say, what happens at 70 if I get confused? But one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is that their spouse or their father, whoever it may be, mother, I'm not picking on any one individual, but they insist upon driving, and their loved one or caregiver says, all right, I'm going to be the passenger in the seat to make sure that they drive well. Well, the only thing I can tell you, folks, is that if a dementia patient or any of us have a startling moment behind the wheel, remember, this is not driver's ed where we have a dual control car with brakes, a gas pedal, and another steering wheel. You're really at the mercy of that individual. And to think that simply because you're in the passenger seat that you have some control, while you might be able to say to them, turn left or turn right, we have to go down this block. But just remember, between reaction time and getting confused, you can wind up right in the middle of that intersection in a pretty nasty accident. And do not fool yourself that simply because you're a passenger in the car and observing what they're doing, that you have any ability to intercede. If you grab the steering wheel, you're only going to have a problem if you try and, because you don't have control over the brakes and the gas. So be very careful not to just let somebody's desire to drive, when it's very obviously that they have cognitive impairment, simply because you're in the car, because you could be just as much a victim as they or anybody else that's involved in a car accident with you.
I thought your suggestion last time of using the cell phone camera to take pictures of each side of the car as a baseline over and above our own subjective opinions as to what's going on and see visually what is happening with the car is at least an indicator of what's happening.
Right. I was doing that with my father.
You had mentioned that.
Yes, but he got wise, and he had a place out of town. He lived in Bal Harbor, and he had a place over on the west side of Miami where he would continually go maybe once a month and have him knock the dents out and do a little touch-up, so that my ability to track all of his, what I used to call parking by braille, got a little confusing. And so, notwithstanding his cognitive, he was still able to be, kind of a sly fox. But it is very helpful sometimes when you have a family member who doesn't really think they're having a problem driving, is to take picture all the way around the car and then come back 30 days later and you can compare it and say, Dad, look, or Mom, look, that bumper didn't have that dent before. There's a big scratch in the door, and you can't blame everything on parking in the supermarket and everybody else hit you.
David, as we're wrapping it up, the holidays in front of us, Christmas and New Year's, what advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, the advice I have for our listeners is very simply this. Do not get so depressed over the holidays because you have a loved one who's not the same way that they used to be. All right? As Dr. Hilfiker just said, you need to live in the moment. And if your loved one still has cognitive capability to do things, or if they're in a facility, enjoy what they can give you. You have to come into their life because they can no longer come into yours. And so for the holidays, go out of your way to recognize that there's still a person inside of that cognitive confusion, and they're entitled to the independence and dignity, quality of life, and respect that any of us deserve, no matter what goes on. And I want to wish our audience, those that didn't celebrate Hanukkah and are coming up to Christmas, have a very, very Merry Christmas. Paul and I will be on next Monday, right before New Year's, to bring you up to date on whatever else is going on. We had a few things that we couldn't cover tonight. But a great holiday to all of you, and enjoy your circumstances, whatever they may be, with a positive outlook. So, Boca Raton, America and the world, have a great holiday. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next Monday. Thank you.
Good night, Dave.
You have been listening and watching David Levy, gerontologist and non-clinical family caregiving expert. Visit our website at caregiverreality.com and hear and see unscripted family caregiver support groups discussing